She climbs into the carriage with her chin high. The decree sits in her lap like a stone she's been told to carry forever. 5 years of marriage. 5 years of silence in her body, where a child should have been. The court calls it barrenness. She calls it a verdict with no trial. The wheels turn east, toward land that hasn't paid taxes in a decade. They are sending her to die slowly, and calling it rest. Her husband signed the paper. He didn't watch her read it. Somewhere behind her, a king touches an empty chair and tells himself it's nothing. Somewhere ahead of her, a ruin waits with its roof half gone and its fields gone to thistle. She does not know yet that the dying land will choose her. She does not know her husband will come back for grain, not love, and find both waiting, and neither of them free. So when the kingdom finally starves, who will the people kneel to? The carriage stops before Brienne is ready for it to stop, and that, she thinks, is fitting. Nothing in the last 6 months has waited for her to be ready. Not the council's whispers, low enough to pretend they weren't meant for her ears. Not the physicians with their cold hands and their colder conclusions. Not Garrick's silence, which had grown over their marriage like ice over a lake, thin enough at first that she could still see movement beneath it, and then, by the end, sealed so solid she stopped trying to break through. She steps down onto gravel that crunches wrong. Too dry, too sparse, weeds pushing up between the stones in defiant green fists. The estate of Vel rises in front of her like an apology no one bothered to finish. Half the east wing has lost its roof to weather and neglect. She can see sky where there should be slate. Ivy has eaten one entire wall, patient and merciless. The fountain in the courtyard holds no water, only a nest of dead leaves and the skeleton of some bird that didn't survive a winter here either. This is what they call a rest estate. This is where the unwanted go to become forgotten, quietly enough that no one has to feel responsible for it. She had expected worse, in some ways. A dungeon dressed in pretty words would have been honest, at least. This is worse in its own way. This is supposed to look like mercy. Una climbs down behind her, and Brienne hears her castellan's breath catch, just slightly, at the sight of it. Una has served her since Brienne was 19 and newly wed, and still believed that a queen's intelligence might someday be wanted instead of merely tolerated. Una has not believed many soft things since. "My lady," Una says, and stops. There isn't a kind way to finish that sentence. Brienne reads the decree again. She has read it 11 times since they left the capital. She's counted. Because counting is something to do with her hands and her eyes that isn't crying. In recognition of the Queen's continued inability to provide an heir, and for the preservation of her health and dignity, Her Grace is granted leave to retire to the eastern estate of Vel, there to rest at the kingdom's expense, indefinitely. Indefinitely. They could not even commit to forever. Forever would have required them to admit what this was. She folds the decree along its old creases. They're soft now, worn from her thumbs, and tucks it into the lining of her cloak, against her ribs, the way you'd carry a splinter. You've decided not to dig out yet, because digging it out would mean feeling it again on the way. Then she looks up at the broken roofline, at the dead fountain, at the weeds growing through gravel that no one has raked in years. And she does the only thing she has left that is entirely hers to choose. She smiles. It is not a soft smile. Una, who knows her better than anyone alive, sees that immediately, sees the way it sits on Brienne's face like a blade laid down on a table, visible, deliberate, meant to be seen. It is the smile of a woman deciding, in real time, that she will not give them the weeping they were hoping for. If they wanted a broken queen quietly disappearing into ruin, they should have built a more convincing ruin. "Well," Brienne says, and her voice doesn't shake, though something underneath it does. "It needs a new roof." Una stares at her for a moment, and then, God help her, laughs, short and disbelieving and a little wet at the edges. "That's all you have to say?" "That's all I'm going to let myself say," Brienne walks toward the broken doors, her skirts dragging through weeds that catch and tear at the hem, and doesn't look back at the carriage. Because if she looks back at the carriage, she might look past it, toward the road that leads home, toward a city and a castle. And a husband who let this happen without once meeting her eyes while it was decided. Come on, if we're going to rot here, Una, we might as well rot somewhere with a working door. She does not weep that first night, though the wind comes through the gap in the roof and finds her wherever she lies. She lies awake instead, listening to the building breathe its broken breath around her, and she thinks, not of Garrick's face when the council read the decree aloud, though she'd looked for something there and found only a kind of practiced stillness, the look of a man holding very still so that nothing shows, but of the empty cradle that had sat, untouched, in a corner of their chambers for the better part of 5 years, because someone, early on, had thought hope worth preparing for. She thinks of how Garrick had stopped looking at that corner of the room sometime around year 3. How she'd kept looking at it anyway, because someone had to, because leaving it empty and unseen felt like a second death on top of the first one. She does not know, not yet, not for months, that the physicians who examined her had been paid quietly by men on the council who wanted a different queen on the throne, one with better alliances and more pliant opinions, one who would not sit in council sessions and ask pointed questions about grain reserves and trade tariffs that made grown men flush with the particular shame of being caught, not knowing the thing they were supposed to know. She does not know that the fault, if fault is even the right word for something that was never true, was never hers at all. She only knows the ache of it, low and constant, like a tooth gone bad. She only knows that she is 28 years old, exiled to a ruin, and that somewhere 100 miles west, a king she loved, past tense already, she's deciding, present tense be damned, is sitting on a throne with an empty chair beside him that he will, though she cannot see it, reach toward more than once in the weeks to come, fingers brushing the carved arm of it like a man checking a wound to see if it stopped bleeding yet. It hasn't. It won't, not for a long time. But she isn't there to see that, and so the silence between them simply continues, vast and growing, the way silences do when no one feeds them anything but more silence. The first month, she does not rebuild anything. The first month, she survives it. There is no glory in those weeks, no triumphant montage of a queen rising from ash. There is only the slow, grinding work of figuring out which rooms still have ceilings, which wells still have clean water, which of the few remaining servants, old Tomas, half blind and stubborn as a mule, a girl named Iris who flinches at loud noises and won't say why, a handful of others, who'd been left behind here because no one wanted them either, can be trusted, and which of them are simply too broken by years of neglect to be useful for anything but pity. Una manages the household with a grim, efficient fury that Brienne recognizes because it mirrors her own. They patch the roof with what materials they can scavenge before the autumn rains come in earnest. They clear the fountain of its dead bird and its drowned leaves, though they cannot get water flowing through it again. Not yet. Not with the cistern half collapsed and no money to repair it. Money. That's the wall she keeps running into, over and over, like a moth against glass. The estate's coffers, what little remained of them, were drained years before she arrived, by stewards who'd long since stopped pretending to manage Vel for anyone's benefit but their own. The land itself. And here is the first thing that surprises her. The first crack of light through a door she hadn't known was there. The land itself is not actually bad. It's been mismanaged into ruin, which is a different thing entirely from being ruined. She walks the eastern fields one gray morning, with her cloak wrapped tight against the wind, and she crouches down. Queens don't crouch, she thinks distantly, and then thinks, I'm not sure what I am anymore, so I suppose I can crouch. And she takes a handful of soil between her fingers and rubs it, the way her grandmother taught her to do once, decades ago. Before Brienne had been married off to a kingdom that needed her dowry more than it ever needed her mind. The soil is good. Rich, dark, full of the kind of life that means things can grow here, if anyone bothers to plant them correctly. If anyone manages the irrigation instead of letting the old channels silt up and crack. If anyone rotates the crops instead of bleeding the same exhausted acreage year after year because it's easier than thinking. Something in her chest, something that had gone very quiet in the long gray months of being a barren queen, with no purpose anyone would grant her, sits up and pays attention. She had a head for this once. Before Garrick, before the throne, before 5 years of being told, gently and then less gently, that her opinions on trade routes and grain stores and tax structures were charming but unnecessary, that a queen's job was to smile and to bear children and to otherwise be quiet. She had grown up the daughter of a minor lord, who'd taught her to read ledgers before she could read poetry, who'd let her sit in on his council meetings because he had no sons and refused to let that mean he had no heir worth training. She had married Garrick, with a mind full of plans for the kind of queen she meant to be, and she had spent 5 years watching those plans get folded smaller and smaller until they fit into the small, decorative box the court had built for her. No one is watching now. No one is here to tell her to be quiet. Una, she says, that evening, over a thin soup that is nonetheless the best meal they've had since arriving, I want to see every ledger this estate has. Every deed, every tax record, every account of what's owed and what's owing. I don't care how old or how dusty. Una looks at her for a long moment, the kind of look that says she understands exactly what kind of fire has just been lit and isn't sure whether to fan it or fear it. You're going to fix this place. I'm going to use this place. Brienne's voice is low, and there's something in it that hasn't been there in years. Not since before the wedding, before the long, slow erosion of being told what she was and wasn't for. They sent me somewhere to disappear, Una. I am not going to disappear. I am going to grow so loud they cannot pretend not to hear me. It isn't love driving her, not yet, not even something so simple as hope. It's something colder and more useful. Spite, distilled down to its purest form, the kind that doesn't burn hot and die fast but burns low and patient, and forever the kind that gets up every morning and does one more thing, and one more thing, and one more thing, until the thing it's been building without anyone's permission has become too large to ignore. She does not know, yet, what it will cost her to want this badly. She only knows that wanting something, even this, even spite, feels better than the long, careful numbness she'd been wearing like armor for longer than she can clearly remember. It takes her 3 years to turn ruin into something worth a name. 3 years, narrated quickly because that is how time moves when you are too busy to grieve properly. Though grief finds its moments anyway. In the smell of wood smoke on a particular kind of cold evening that reminds her, traitorously, of winters in the capital. In the sight of a child running through the new market square, laughing, that makes her hand drift unconsciously to her own flat stomach, before she catches herself and makes it stop. She does not let herself linger in those moments. She has fields to plan, channels to dig, a granary to fill before the first real winter tests whether any of this was real or only the performance of a woman too proud to admit defeat. It is not performance. That becomes clear by the second harvest. She reworks the irrigation herself, walking the old channels with Tomas, who despite his failing eyes remembers, somehow, in his hands and feet, where the water used to run before decades of neglect, let it silt into uselessness. She brings in a handful of tenant farmers who'd fled Vel years before for better managed lands, luring them back not with promises. Promises are cheap and she has none worth giving yet, but with a simple, radical offer. A fair share of what they grow, recorded honestly, paid honestly, with no steward skimming a third off the top before anyone else sees the ledger. Word of that alone brings people. Fairness, it turns out, is rarer than gold and travels faster. She does not do it gently. There is nothing gentle about clearing collapsed stone from a granary roof with her own hands, because there's no one else free to do it, about negotiating with grain merchants, who try, at first, to cheat the exiled queen because surely she's too desperate and too foolish to know better. She learns to recognize that look in a man's eyes. The assumption that a woman alone, however highborn, can be talked down, talked over, talked out of what's hers, and she learns, with a grim satisfaction that surprises her, how good it feels to prove that assumption wrong. By the second autumn, Vel's granaries are full enough to sell surplus. By the third, the market square, rebuilt from a refuse heap into something with proper stalls and a covered space for trading in bad weather, draws merchants from provinces that had never bothered to send so much as a letter to the old, dying estate. None of it travels back to the capital quickly. The court is not interested in news from the place it has gone to such trouble to forget. But trade routes don't care about court interest, and merchants talk, and slowly. The way water finds its way through the smallest crack in stone, patient, relentless, word begins to move west. There's a province out east that's thriving. Tea, the talk goes, in taverns and trading posts, and the kind of low rooms where actual information changes hands more honestly than it does at court, run by some exiled noblewoman. Fair prices, good grain, roads kept clear. No one in the capital connects this, at first, to the discarded queen they assume is quietly fading into irrelevance somewhere in the east. Why would they? They didn't think she had it in her. They never bothered to find out. She thinks of Garrick sometimes. Of course she does, she'd be lying to herself otherwise. And she has stopped lying to herself about most things, even if she hasn't stopped lying to him. In the unsent letters she writes some nights and burns before dawn, the ones that say things like, "I think you knew it wasn't true," and let them say it anyway, and "I dream about the cradle in the corner more than I dream about you. And I don't know what that means except that I'm trying to stop dreaming about either." She burns those letters because sending them would mean admitting she still has something left to lose, and she has decided, with the same cold deliberateness she brings to every ledger and every harvest, that she will not give anyone, not the court, not the council, not even herself, the satisfaction of watching her still want him. She does not know that 100 miles west, in a castle growing colder by increments he refuses to name, Garrick has begun a habit he hides even from himself, his hand drifting, in council sessions, to the carved arm of the empty chair beside the throne, fingers finding the worn place where her hand used to rest, as though checking, again and again, whether the wound has started to close. It hasn't. 3 years on, it hasn't even begun. The first sign that anything is wrong with the kingdom proper comes the way these things always come. Quietly, in numbers no one wants to read aloud, in a harvest report that uses the word shortfall instead of the truer word, which is failure. The blight starts in the western provinces, the ones the council always treated as the kingdom's breadbasket, the ones that fed everyone else, and were therefore, in the council's collective and catastrophic wisdom, never diversified, never given the kind of careful rotation and irrigation investment that might have let them survive a single bad season. Let alone 2. The council had spent the last several years congratulating itself on stability. Stability, it turns out, is not the same as inscience. It is, in fact, often its opposite, a wall built so thick and so unchanging that no one notices it has no foundation left to stand on. Garrick learns of the first failed harvest in a council session he almost didn't attend, distracted as he's been by a dozen smaller crises, that all, in retrospect, were symptoms of the same rot. He listens to Lord Aldous, the same Aldous who pushed hardest, 5 years ago, for the Queen's exile, the same Aldous whose daughter was meant to take her place on the throne and never quite managed it, because Garrick, to his own quiet shame, found he could not make himself remarry, could not make himself sit across a dinner table from anyone else and pretend the silence wasn't a hole shaped exactly like Brienne. Listens to Aldous explain away the shortfall with the smooth, practiced calm of a man who has never once been held accountable for anything in his life. A bad season, Aldous says. These things happen. We'll manage the reserves carefully and… What reserves? Garrick says. The silence that follows tells him everything he needs to know, and it tells him in the particular language of court silence, which he has grown fluent in over the years without ever choosing to be. The silence of men who know exactly how bad something is and have been hoping, against all evidence that hoping would be sufficient strategy. There are no reserves. There were reserves, once, managed by a careful hand that understood the difference between a kingdom that looks prosperous and one that is prosperous, a hand that had, in fact, quietly overseen most of the actual granary policy for the better part of 3 years early in his reign, while the council took credit for harvests she'd planned, while Garrick himself, distracted by border disputes and the constant pressure of proving himself a strong king to men twice his age, had simply assumed the kingdom ran itself because it had never occurred to him to ask, who was running it? He doesn't let himself finish that thought all the way, not yet. It sits there anyway, at the edge of him, the way a draft sits at the edge of a room even when you can't see where it's coming from. The second failed harvest comes the following year, worse than the first. The council's careful management, which was never careful, only convenient, runs the granaries dry by midwinter. Bread prices triple. Riots start in the lower city, small at first, contained, and then less small, less contained, as hunger does what hunger always does to patience. By the time the third bad season hits, there are armed bands moving through the western provinces calling themselves rebels. Though Garrick privately thinks the word dignifies something that started, simply, as starving people taking up pitchforks and old swords because no one in power had given them any better option. He does not say this aloud in council. Saying it aloud would mean admitting that the people might have a point, and admitting that would mean admitting a great many other things he has spent 5 years carefully not admitting. It is Una, of all people, the Castellan he'd dismissed from his memory along with everything else east of the capital, who finally forces the admission, though not directly, not on purpose. A merchant returning from the eastern road, fleeing the worst of the unrest, mentions in passing, to a guard who mentions it to a steward who, for reasons of his own ambition, makes sure it reaches the king's ears, that the eastern estate of Vel, the one everyone forgot, the one that was meant to be a slow grave for an unwanted queen, has grain, has plenty of grain, has a granary system so well managed that its surplus has been quietly feeding half the eastern trade routes for 2 years running, while the rest of the kingdom started to starve. Garrick is in his private chambers when he hears this, and he goes very still in the particular way he goes still when something has hit him somewhere it actually hurts, rather than somewhere convenient to perform hurting. Vel, he says, and his voice doesn't carry the question he means it to carry, the one that's really asking, how? How is that possible? I sent her there to be forgotten. I sent her there to be nothing. Tis because some part of him, the part he spent 5 years keeping leashed and quiet, already knows exactly how. Already knew it before this moment, in the way you know a thing in your gut long before your mind agrees to look at it directly. He doesn't sleep that night. He sits by a cold hearth with a cup of wine he doesn't drink, and he thinks, for the first time and longer than he wants to admit, about a woman with ink-stained fingers who used to sit up past midnight beside him, going over harvest projections he'd skimmed and signed without truly reading, because she'd liked it, because she was good at it, because, and here is the thought he's avoided for 5 years, the one that finally catches him, alone, in the dark, because the prosperous years of his reign, the years everyone praised him for, were years she'd had a hand in more deeply than anyone, including himself, had ever let her be credited for. He doesn't move toward fixing any of it yet, not that night. That night, He only sits with the shape of what he's beginning to understand, the way you sit with a bruise you've just discovered, pressings on it slightly to test how deep it goes, and finding, with each small test, that it goes deeper than you'd feared. The thing about a hidden engine is that it does not announce itself. It only keeps running, quietly, until someone finally lifts the panel and sees what's been turning the gears all along. Here is what Garrick begins, slowly and with a growing and uncomfortable certainty, to remember. Brienne, in the 3rd year of their marriage, sitting at the long table in the Privy Council chamber long after the lords had gone to their dinners, going over grain allocation charts with a focus that the lords themselves never bothered to bring to the same task, because, to them, it was beneath their attention. The kind of detail work meant for clerks and stewards, not for men who fancied themselves strategists of higher matters. He remembers. And this memory arrives with a particular cold clarity, the kind that makes him feel ill, that it had been her idea, originally, to diversify the Western Province's crop rotation, an idea Aldous had taken to the council a week later and presented as his own, and that Garrick, distracted, pleased simply that the idea existed at all, had never once corrected the record, had never even thought to. He remembers that the irrigation reforms credited in official record to a council engineer named Varick had actually originated in a series of detailed notes Brienne kept in a private ledger. Notes Garrick had seen, had even glanced through once, admiring, in an absent husbandly way, how thorough she was, the way you might admire a wife's needlework, without considering that the wife herself might have rather been doing something the kingdom needed more. He remembers, and this one lands hardest, because it answers a question he never let himself ask, plainly, that in the year before the physicians declared her barren, she had been working 18-hour days managing a grain crisis in the southern provinces that the council had been too slow and too proud to address themselves, working herself thin and pale and exhausted, in service of a kingdom that would, within the year, decide her body's failure to produce an heir, was reason enough to throw the rest of her away. He does not know, cannot know yet, whether that exhaustion had anything to do with the years of childlessness that followed, whether grief and grinding overwork and the particular cruelty of being essential and unacknowledged, all at once had done something to her body that no physician's report would ever honestly name, because naming it would have meant admitting the court had worked its own queen half to death, while publicly insisting she did nothing at all. He only knows, sitting alone with a cup of wine gone cold, that the story he was told about his wife, barren, useless, a burden the kingdom could not afford to keep, was a story written by men who needed her gone for reasons that had nothing to do with her body, and everything to do with how inconvenient it had become to have a queen who understood the kingdom better than the council that was supposed to run it. He had let them write that story. He had signed it himself, in the end, with his own hand, on parchment he'd barely read, because reading it carefully would have meant feeling something he'd trained himself, through 5 years of careful council pressure, not to feel. That is the assumption the listener has been allowed to hold since the very first scene. That Brienne failed at the one thing a queen was meant to do, and that her exile, however cruel, was at least honest in its reasoning. It was never honest. The barrenness was never the truth being punished. It was the excuse built to cover a different truth, that a woman too capable, too clear-eyed, too willing to ask the council uncomfortable questions about where the money went, had become more dangerous sitting beside the throne than she would ever be banished from it. And the land kneels to her now, 3 years into her exile, not because of fate or fortune, but because she is, simply, doing what she has always quietly done. Except now there is no council to steal the credit, no husband too distracted to notice, no court whispering that her opinions are charming but unnecessary. There is only the work, and the work is hers, fully and finally for the first time in her life. It should feel like vindication. Some nights, alone, it almost does. Most nights, it feels like grief wearing a crown made of harvest reports. Proof, undeniable proof, of exactly how much she was always worth, arriving 5 years too late to undo what the proving cost her. He comes to Vel himself before he sends anyone in his name, not because pride lets him, but because pride, for once, loses the argument to desperation, and desperation, when it finally wins, doesn't bother to dress itself in dignity. He comes first, though, not as a man. He comes as a wolf. It happens 3 days before his formal arrival, though no one in Vel understands at first what they're seeing. A gray shape appears at the edge of the eastern fields one dusk, large even for a wolf, with eyes that catch the last light strangely, and instead of hunting or fleeing, it simply walks, slow, deliberate, unmistakably, purposeful, straight to the gate of Vel's rebuilt keep, and lies down. It does not growl at the guards who raise their spears. It does not flinch when Tomas, brave or foolish or both, approaches close enough to see the scar through its left eyebrow, the one shaped like a crescent moon, the one that Una recognizes instantly because she has seen its match on a king's face 100 times across a council table years ago, before everything broke. "That's him," Una says, very quietly, standing at an upper window with her hand pressed flat against the cold glass. "Brienne. That's him." Brienne comes to the window herself, and her breath does something complicated and involuntary in her chest at the sight of that gray shape lying in the dirt of her own gate, patient as stone, and she hates the way her body responds before her mind has any say in the matter. The warmth that floods up through her despite 3 years of careful, deliberate, exhausting effort to feel nothing at the mention of his name. The fated bond does not care about her pride. It never has. It simply recognizes, the way a key recognizes a lock it was cut for, and it does not ask permission first. She does not go out to him. Not that first night. Pride, even wounded, even cracking at the seams, holds the door shut a little longer. He does not eat. The servants, confused and a little frightened, leave meat near the gate, and the wolf does not touch it. He does not leave, either, through a cold night and then a colder one, lying in the dirt with a patience that Brienne, watching from the window with her arms wrapped tight around herself, finds almost unbearable to witness. Because she remembers, suddenly and unwillingly, every other version of his stubbornness she's ever loved. Every time he dug in on something he believed mattered and simply would not move, and some traitor part of her chest aches at seeing that same stubbornness turned, finally, toward her instead of away. "He'll make himself sick," Una says on the second morning, watching the wolf's sides rise and fall, slower now, more labored. "Brienne, he's not leaving." "I know," Brienne says. "Are you going to let him starve at your gate out of spite?" Brienne is quiet for a long moment, looking down at the gray shape that used to share her bed and her crown, and, for a handful of good years before the council's poison crept all the way through, something that felt, at the time, indistinguishable from happiness. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she admits, and it's the first honest uncertainty she's allowed herself to say aloud in 3 years. "I only know I'm not ready yet." She goes out on the third morning, not because she's ready, but because some things outlast readiness, because watching him refuse food at her gate has become a wound of its own, a new one, layered over old ones, and because some buried, traitorous part of her has never stopped being the kind of woman who cannot, in the end, watch someone she's loved starve themselves over her, however richly she might believe he deserves the discomfort. She walks out alone, wrapped in a plain gray cloak, no crown, no court finery, nothing of the queen the council tried to erase, only herself and the cold morning air, and the particular ache of approaching something she has spent 3 years building walls against. The wolf lifts his head when she's still 20 paces off. His eyes find hers and hold, and she feels it land somewhere low and helpless in her chest. The pull, the old unbearable pull, exactly as strong as it was the day they married, undimmed by exile or anger or years of careful, deliberate not thinking. About him, her breath catches. She does not look away. She stops 3 paces from him, close enough to smell him. Wood smoke and pine and something underneath that is just him, unmistakable. The scent her body has apparently spent 3 years quietly, treacherously memorizing despite every effort to forget it, and far enough to still, technically, claim she kept her distance. "You look thin," she says, and her voice comes out rougher than she means it to. "Stop being dramatic and shift back before you catch your death in my dirt." The wolf's ears flick. For a moment, nothing happens, and then the shift takes him, the way it always does, fast and unglamorous and faintly painful looking even after all these years, until Garrick is kneeling in the mud at her gate in human shape, bare-chested and shivering, looking up at her with an expression she has not seen on his face since the early days of their marriage. Before the council's pressure calcified something in him she'd once believed unshakable. He does not stand. He stays exactly where he is, on his knees in the dirt of the estate he sent her to die in, and he says, voice cracked in a way she's never once heard it crack, not even at his own father's funeral. "I should have come 3 years ago." "Yes," Brienne says. "You should have." She does not help him up. Not yet. But she does not turn and walk away either, and for both of them in that frozen, fragile moment, that small mercy. Staying feels louder than anything either of them could have said. He does eat, eventually, though it takes Una's bullying and 3 bowls of broth before color comes back fully to his face. Brienne does not feed him herself. She makes that point with the same deliberate precision she's brought to every harvest and every ledger these past 3 years. Small, exact, impossible to mistake for anything but what it is. She does, however, sit across the table from him while he eats. Because there are things that need saying that cannot be said through a window or shouted across a courtyard. And because, though she will not admit this part even to Una, some part of her still wants, achingly, to look at his face while he says them. "Tell me why you're really here," she says. "And don't say it's for me. We both know that's not what brought a king's wolf to a gate he hasn't crossed in 3 years. Garrick sets down the spoon. His hands, she notices, are not as steady as they used to be. There's a tremor in them now that wasn't there when he was simply a young king certain of his own righteousness. "The western harvests have failed 3 years running," he says. "The granaries are empty. There are riots in the lower city I can't put down without burning it, and I won't burn my own people to keep order. Half the council that pushed for your exile is now blaming each other in front of me like children, and none of them has a single useful idea between them." He looks up. Vel has grain. Vel has more than grain. Vel has roads that work, and trade routes that hold, and a granary system that's apparently been feeding half the East while the rest of the kingdom starved. "And I came here because I am out of every other option, Brienne. And because..." He stops. She waits, unmoving, unwilling to fill his silence for him the way she filled so many of his silences for 5 married years. Smoothing over what he couldn't quite say so the court would never see him falter. "And because I finally understand," he says, low, "that the kingdom's good years, the ones I was praised for, were never mine. They were yours. You ran half of it quietly while I sat on the throne taking credit I never earned. And when your body didn't do the one thing men like Aldous decided mattered most, they convinced me, or I let myself be convinced, because it was easier than fighting them, that the woman who'd been holding the whole structure up was somehow the weak point in it." His jaw works. "I was wrong. I have been wrong for 5 years, Brienne, and I let it cost you everything, and now I am asking you, not the council, not the kingdom, me, to help me fix what I broke. It would be easy," she thinks, watching him, "to let this be the moment everything resolves." The genre she half remembers from old songs and older stories wants this to be the moment the proud man falls and the wronged woman forgives, swift and complete. because the story has run its course, and everyone is tired and wants the ache to end. But she has spent 3 years building something real out of ruin, and real things do not resolve in a single conversation, however raw. "You're not asking me to help you," she says quietly. "You're asking me to save you. Those aren't the same request, Garrick, and I think you know it." She lets that sit a moment, watching it land. "I fed your Western refugees last spring, did you know that? The ones who marched on your court with pitchforks because they were starving and no one above them would listen. They came through here on their way back, broken and ashamed and half frozen, and I fed them anyway, because punishing hungry people for being hungry has never once struck me as justice. I didn't do that for you. I didn't even do it for the kingdom, not really. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and I have spent 3 years finally being allowed to do the right thing without someone deciding. It was too much trouble to let me." Garrick says nothing. There is nothing, she thinks, watching the way grief moves visibly through his face without his trying to hide it anymore, that he could say that would not sound smaller than the silence. "So," she says, and her voice gentles, just slightly, against her own better judgment, "if I help you now, and I haven't said I will, not yet, it will not be because you came here and said pretty, true things in my dining hall. It will be because I have spent 3 years learning that I am capable of choosing mercy even toward people who never once offered it to me first. That is not the same as forgiveness, Garrick. Don't mistake one for the other." "I won't," he says, and for the first time since he knelt in her mud, there's something almost like hope in it, fragile and unearned and entirely his to lose again if he isn't careful. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to let me earn the chance to." She does not answer him that night, and the not answering is its own kind of mercy, because some questions deserve more than an immediate response, and Brienne has learned, in 3 hard years, the particular power of letting silence do work that words would only rush. She lies awake instead, in the room that has become entirely hers. No husband's chambers adjoining, no shared hearth, nothing that was ever built with him in mind. And she takes out, from the bottom of a chest she keeps locked even from Una, a stack of letters tied with plain string. Letters she wrote and never sent. Letters that say things like, "I think I could have loved you better if you'd let me be more than decorative. Fee and I keep the cradle's memory the way you keep a scar, not because I want to, but because some things don't let you forget them even when you try. Te," and the last one, written only weeks ago, before the wolf appeared at her gate. "I have built something that is entirely mine, and some nights that feels like the only victory I will ever get, and other nights it feels like proof that I have only ever known how to love things, by working myself half to death for them, you included, and I do not know yet whether that is wisdom or wound." She does not know that Una found an earlier batch of these letters, years ago, half burned and abandoned in a hearth. Brienne thought she'd cleared completely, and that Una, without telling Brienne, in a quiet act of loyalty that bent the rules of loyalty itself, kept the unburned fragments, and that those fragments now sit, carefully preserved, in a drawer of Garrick's private study back at the capital, smuggled there months ago by a steward Una has quietly corresponded with since this whole disaster began, because some part of Una, watching her queen grieve a man she refused to admit she still loved, had decided that he deserved, at minimum, to know the shape of what he'd thrown away. Garrick has read those fragments more times than he could count, late at night by candlelight in the chair beside the empty one, and it is those fragments, more than the granary reports, more than the council's panic, more than even his own slow unraveling guilt, that finally sent his wolf running east 3 days ahead of his own human pride. Brienne does not know this yet. She thinks the letters were ash. She does not know that some of her rawest, most unsent honesty has already been seen by exactly the person she swore she'd never let see it, and that he came to her gate already half undone by words she believed were destroyed. She will learn this later. Tonight, she simply ties the string back around the new letter, unsent like all the others, and places it with the rest and tries to sleep, and does not entirely succeed, because some doors, once opened even a crack, let in more light and more cold than you were prepared for either way. The negotiation, when it comes the next morning, is conducted the way Brienne conducts everything now, with ledgers open on the table, with numbers that do not lie even when men do, with a clarity that makes Garrick, watching her work, feel something close to awe layered over the grief. Because this is who she always was, this exact competence, and he spent 5 years letting other men convince him it was decoration. I will send grain, Brienne says, enough to break the worst of the famine through this winter, not because you asked nicely, and not because I owe you anything. I don't, Garrick, and we should both be honest about that, but because there are children starving in your western provinces who never once voted for the council that exiled me, and I will not let them pay for the council's cruelty with their lives when I have the means to stop it. Name your price, Garrick says. I'm not selling you grain, Garrick. I'm choosing to give it. Her eyes are steady on his. But if you want my partnership, if you want Vel's roads and trade routes and granary systems integrated permanently into the kingdom's recovery, instead of treated as some emergency favor, you'll forget the moment the crisis passes. Then yes, there is a price, and it isn't gold. Tell me, I want it known, she says, slow and exact, each word placed like a stone in a wall she's spent 3 years learning to build. Publicly, before your court, before the people who decided I was disposable, that the prosperity they praised you for during our marriage was built in significant part by me. Not as a footnote, not as a gracious mention. As fact, recorded in the same official histories that recorded my exile as a kindness. I want the truth of who built what corrected in front of the same people who told a lie about my body to cover for their own greed. Her voice doesn't rise. It doesn't need to. I am not asking to be reinstated as your queen, Garrick. I have built something here that is mine in a way nothing at court ever was. I am asking to be seen. Finally, honestly, in front of everyone who decided it was easier to look away. Garrick is quiet for a long moment. Then he says, simply, that's not a price. That's a debt I should have paid 5 years ago without you having to ask. Yes, Brienne says. It is. And the fact that you understand that now doesn't erase the 5 years it took you to get there. But it's a start. She closes the ledger between them, a small final sound. We'll discuss the grain shipments with Una. The other matter, the public reckoning, that happens at Vel, Garrick. Not at your capital, where your court can control the room and soften the truth before it ever reaches the people. It happens here, in front of the people who took me in when your kingdom threw me away. If you want to make this right, you do it on my ground. He agrees. Of course he agrees. There is, by this point, very little he would not agree to, and some part of Brienne, watching the speed of his agreement, feels the old ache flicker again. Now, he listens. Now that listening costs him so much less than it would have cost him 5 years ago, when listening might have meant standing against Aldous and the council before they'd built enough momentum to ruin her. She does not say this aloud. She has learned which truths to speak immediately and which to let sit, ripening, until the moment calls for them properly. The convoy of grain leaves Vel within the week. Wagon after wagon, more than Garrick had dared hope for, enough to see the western provinces through the worst of winter and into a spring that might, with careful planning, finally break the cycle of failed harvests if the council can be made to actually follow Brienne's recommendations on rotation and irrigation this time, rather than stealing the ideas and crediting themselves while ignoring the parts too difficult to implement quickly. Word of the grain convoy travels faster than the wagons themselves. By the time the shipment reaches the western provinces, the story has already outrun it. The exiled queen is saving us. The exiled queen has more mercy than the whole court combined. And Brienne hears, secondhand, through merchants and Una's careful network of correspondence, that the very rebels who marched on the capital with pitchforks, the ones she fed without asking their politics when they straggled brokenly past Vel last spring, are now the loudest voices insisting that whatever reckoning is coming should happen in the open, where everyone can see it. She did not plan that. She finds, examining the feeling honestly, that she does not entirely mind it either. The public reckoning is set for the first thaw, a date chosen deliberately, Brienne's idea, because she wants Garrick to make this journey east, not as a desperate man fleeing famine in winter's worst grip, but as a clear-eyed one walking toward consequence in daylight he cannot claim was forced on him by weather or panic. If he is going to kneel, he is going to kneel because he chose to, with nothing left to blame but himself. Word travels of that too, of a date, a place, a promise that something significant will happen at the ruin-turned province of Vel when the snow finally breaks. By the time the appointed day arrives, the courtyard that once held a dead fountain and a nest of birds' bones has filled with more people than Brienne has ever seen, gathered in one place since her wedding day, 5 years and a lifetime ago. Vel's own people, farmers and merchants and the children born here, who have never known another home. Western refugees who walked days to be present, some of them recognizing Una from the breadlines last spring and weeping openly at the sight of her, and, arriving last, in a procession stripped deliberately of its usual pageantry, the Alpha King himself, dismounting at the edge of the crowd rather than riding through it, because Brienne sent word ahead, simple and absolute. You arrive on foot, or you do not arrive at all. The courtyard is loud with breath held collectively, the particular silence of a crowd that knows it is witnessing something it will tell its grandchildren about. Brienne stands at the top of the repaired stone steps, the same steps that were rubble when she first arrived, that she cleared with her own hands in the first brutal month of exile, wearing not court finery but something simpler, and somehow more commanding. Deep green, the color of Vel's own fields in high summer. No crown, because she does not need a crown here to be unmistakably the one who rules. Garrick walks through the parted crowd alone. No guard, no council, no retinue. He insisted on that himself, against the protests of advisers who feared the optics of a king walking undefended through a province he'd once tried to erase. He understood, finally, what Brienne understood 3 years ago at this same gate, that some moments only mean something if you arrive at them with nothing to hide behind. He stops at the base of the steps. He looks up at her, and the courtyard goes, if possible, even quieter, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses against the eardrums. Brienne does not speak first. She has learned the power of letting other people fill silences they created. 5 years ago, Garrick says, and his voice carries, trained by years of council addresses to reach a crowd without shouting. Though there's a roughness in it now that no training ever put there. I signed a decree exiling my wife to this estate, on the grounds that she had failed to give the kingdom an heir. I told myself at the time that I was protecting her, sparing her further scrutiny, further cruelty from a court that had already decided what it wanted to believe about her. That was a lie I told myself because the truth was harder to face. He pauses. The crowd does not move. The truth is that men on my council wanted her gone, because she was better at governing this kingdom than any of them, and I let them convince me that her competence was somehow the same thing as her failure, because confronting them would have cost me more than I was willing to pay. I chose my own comfort over my wife's truth. I have spent 3 years discovering exactly what that cost. Not just her, but every person in this kingdom who starved this winter, because the woman who actually understood how to keep us fed was sitting in exile instead of at my side. He kneels. Not a practiced, ceremonial kneel. Brienne has seen those 1,000 times at court, smooth and rehearsed and meaningless. This is rougher than that. his knee finding stone hard enough that she sees him wince, his head bowing not in performance, but in something that looks, to everyone watching, indistinguishable from genuine grief finally let loose after years of containment. I am not asking you to come back as my queen because the kingdom needs your grain, he says. And his voice cracks on the last word, the same crack she heard at the gate 3 weeks ago, except this time the whole courtyard hears it too. I am asking the kingdom to see, finally, publicly, in the same official record that called your exile a kindness, that you were never the failure they named you. You were the foundation. You were the reason these people had bread when my own court could not manage to feed them. I was wrong, and I am sorry, and I will spend whatever years you allow me proving that sorry is not the same as nothing. But the choice of what happens next, Brienne, is entirely yours. I am not asking you to forgive me today. I am asking you to let the truth stand where the lie used to. The silence afterward is the loudest thing Brienne has ever heard. She looks down at him, at the alpha king of a kingdom that threw her away, kneeling in the courtyard of the ruin he sent her to die in front of the very people who built something out of that ruin with her. People who do not need him to tell them what she's worth, because they have watched her prove it with their own eyes for 3 years running. And something in her chest, something she has kept carefully bolted since the carriage first stopped on broken gravel, finally, slowly, begins to loosen. She does not run to him. She does not weep, not yet, not where everyone can see. She walks down the steps instead, slow and deliberate, the same way she walked toward his wolf at the gate 3 weeks ago, and she stops in front of him. Close enough now that she can smell him properly, wood smoke and pine, and the particular warmth underneath that her body has never once managed to forget, despite 3 years of trying. And she says, quiet enough that only he in the front rows can hear it, though it will be repeated in the days and years after, by everyone who was close enough to catch it. Stand up, Garrick. I did not build all this so you could kneel in my dirt forever. I built it so I would never again have to wonder what I was worth without someone else's permission to know it. He stands, slowly, carefully, like a man unsure his legs will hold him. Does that mean? He starts. It means, Brienne says, that the truth stands now, exactly where you said it should. It means Vel is mine, and it remains mine, and any partnership between your kingdom and this province happens on those terms, permanently, recorded honestly, with my name on every record that earned it. She pauses, and something almost gentle moves through her voice, careful and unhurried. It means I am not the same woman who climbed into that carriage 5 years ago believing herself unwanted. I built something true out of what you threw away, Garrick, and I am not interested in folding that truth back into a crown that already failed to protect it once. Then what are you interested in? He asks, and there's something raw and unguarded in the question. A man genuinely asking rather than maneuvering for an answer he's already decided he wants to hear. Brienne looks at him for a long moment, at the scar through his eyebrow, at the particular gray of eyes that have apparently not stopped finding hers across 5 years and 100 miles, and every wall she built to keep them out. And she says, simply, honestly, the way she has learned to say true things now that no one is left to punish her for saying them. I don't know yet. But for the first time in 5 years, Garrick, I'm allowed to take my time finding out, and so are you. That will have to be enough, for now, for both of us. It is not the ending the old songs would write. There is no immediate embrace, no crown placed back on her head before the cheering crowd, no neat bow tying every loose thread into the satisfying knot a simpler story would demand. There is only a man standing in the dirt of a courtyard he once condemned his wife to rot in, and a woman who built a kingdom out of that condemnation, looking at each other with the particular, fragile honesty of 2 people who have finally stopped lying. To the court, to each other, and, hardest of all, to themselves. That evening, after the crowd has dispersed and the wagons of grain have been counted, and the official scribes have recorded, in ink that will not be quietly erased this time, the truth of what built Vel's prosperity and what built the old kingdoms too. Una finds Brienne alone on the rebuilt parapet, looking out over fields that were thistle and ruin 5 years ago, and are now, in the long gold light of evening, something closer to what they were always meant to be. "You didn't take him back," Una says. "It isn't quite a question." "Not yet," Brienne says. "Maybe not ever, not in the way the old songs mean it, but I let him stand, Una. I let the truth stand instead of the lie. That's not nothing." She is quiet a moment, watching the light move gold and slow across fields that answer to her hand now and only hers. "I spent 5 years being told I was the broken thing in that marriage. I'm done apologizing for being whole." Below, in the fields she rebuilt with her own 2 hands, and a spike that turned, slowly, and without her quite noticing the turning, into something steadier and more like purpose. A gray shape moves at the edge of the tree line, patient, unhurried, no longer pleading, simply present, the way the fated bond has always been present, undimmed by exile, unbroken by anger, waiting now not to be fed or forgiven, but simply to be allowed to stay close enough that, someday, when she's ready, the distance between them might finally close on her terms instead of anyone else's. She does not call him closer tonight. She does not send him away either. She stands at the wall of the place that was meant to be her grave, watching her own fields turn gold. And for the first time in longer than she can clearly remember, the silence inside her does not feel like absence. It feels, instead, like room enough, finally, to grow into whatever comes next. And that, dear listener, is where I'll leave them tonight. Not at an ending, exactly, but at the start of something steadier, something earned the slow, hard way instead of given cheap. Some walls, it turns out, are only ever waiting for the right person to learn what they can become. If you stayed this long, you already know why I tell these stories. For the ache that finally gets to rest. For the proud ones who learn how to kneel. For the quiet, stubborn women who build their own kingdoms out of whatever they're given, ruin included. Come back soon. There's always another door waiting to be walked through, and I'll be right here, ready to open it with you.